You're listening to the American edition of The Voice of Russia. I'm Rick Young in Washington. There's new North and South Korea tensions with, of course, the U.S. involved. My guest is Dr. Sreeram Chaulia. Dr. Chaulia is Executive Director of the Center for Global Governance and Policy at the Jindal School of International Affairs. He's also a frequent columnist in journals across the globe. We're talking to him in New Delhi, India. Doctor, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure to be on your show, Rick.
First of all, let's talk about the reality of these of the tensions between North and South Korea. We've all heard of the threats that Kim Jong Un has made against South Korea and the U.S. Obviously, we have to take them seriously, but is he truly ready to go to war?
I don't believe so. As you know, this regime is still in the making. It's a new regime. Kim Jong Un's succession is still incomplete. In fact, they've just named new premier, and all these are attempts to bolster the third Kim's position within the ruling elites. And I think we must tie to domestic politics. Of course, there is also what can be seen as provocation by the United States and its allies in the region, especially in the form of all these stealth bomber sorties that have been flying around, the B-52, the F-22, B-2, and so on. And in fact, the Chinese have been saying that all these, plus the missile defense shields that are being bolstered in Alaska and in Japan, all these are antagonizing North Korea and driving it against a wall and increasing its usual paranoia by many-fold. So there is a paranoid insecurity syndrome that has always informed North Korea. And in fact, the Communist Party paper there, recently wrote, "We are not a pushover like Iraq or Libya." So what they mean here clearly is that they are claiming that there's a likelihood of a U.S. invasion, and therefore, all the bluster. But as I said before, there is a regime insecurity within the Kim circle, and I think they're trying to consolidate through by shifting the rhetoric against what they call the imperialists and the puppets, by which they mean South Korea, seen as a puppet of the West. So there is a lot of bluster. Sometimes people argue also that the bluster is also meant to extract more concessions. It's a kind of blackmail strategy, and maybe that's also working. But I don't think, frankly, North Korea may say that we will attack mainland United States, but the point is it doesn't have the intercontinental ballistic missile capability, nor most people don't believe that it has the miniaturized warheads to be able to actually launch a nuclear war as it's threatening. So I think there's a need for taking it a little coolly and also looking at the other side and whether they are also provoking matters through these missile defense build-ups and through these bombing sorties.
Well, the most recent development is that North Korea has announced that it is going to revive a dormant nuclear reactor that was closed down, I think, about 5 years ago. Is this, again, another effort to somehow show its people that it's standing up to the bully West?
Yeah, and remember, these nuclear projects are tied into an intricate cat-and-mouse kind of game where North Korea keeps saying, "Catch me if you can," and in return, they expect some concessions. So the six-party talks and all these multilateral initiatives have broken down, and it's quite possible, if you look back in history of the last 15, 20 years, that North Korea may soon de-escalate tensions, look at its own domestic economy, and try to reform its moribund domestic economy, and then say, "Come, let's talk." And often they use these as bargaining chips. It's like saying, "I've restarted the nuclear complex, and now I'm willing to lay it down as a card that can be traded for aid or for humanitarian assistance." So, or for easing of sanctions. So it's like, in a way, there is a method to the madness, as some people say, to what the North Koreans are doing, because these are the only bargaining chips they have given their weakness vis-a-vis South Korea, vis-a-vis Japan, and definitely vis-a-vis the United States. But I will go back to the earlier point, and I appreciated the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov saying that, we must avoid a vicious circle. That's the phrase he used. And I always think about it because, the Chinese are saying that all these so-called defensive maneuvers by the U.S. are making it worse and antagonizing North Korea. But the Americans claim that, these maneuvers are to preserve the peace and stability in the Korean Peninsula. Who is right? I mean, the North Koreans clearly, despite losing a lot of goodwill with their patron China, the North Koreans are still seem to be echoing what the Chinese are saying, which is that, don't push us into a corner, and then you will get this fiery rhetoric, which is the very nature of that regime.
But as you say, sounds more like a game of political cat and mouse. But overall, what does North Korea win? What does it profit by this these continuing threats against the West and South Korea and putting armies on alert?
I think the external gains from this kind of saber rattling are not many. In fact, I think what they have lost in the last, say, year or so seems to be that they even lost the trust and the support of their principal patron, which is China. It does look like the Chinese are also somewhat exasperated with North Korean behavior, although it cuts both ways because the Chinese cannot afford to let go. So I think that North Korea is probably erring on the side of bravado rather than caution. But I guess, as I said before, it helps to be tough in front of a home audience, where the UN says 3/4 of the population is going through major food shortages.
Right.
And it also helps externally insofar as it raises the ante and says that, now that I've drawn the sword out this much, for me to put it back, you will have to give me a lot more than before. So it's a kind of, they have, it's a trademark North Korean strategy. You call it blackmail. But one thing is, I think the U.S. actions and the Western actions in Libya and in Iraq before have hardened the regime's belief that one day there may be another Western invasion, and they believe that possessing nuclear weapons and building more advanced weapons, both plutonium and possibly uranium, would only be their guarantors. In fact, I think the North Koreans know that if there is, let's say, a conflict, the Chinese may not come to their rescue as they did in the Korean War in the 1950s.
Well, that was
this time, probably.
That was my.
So therefore, self-help and nuclear weapons seem to be, unfortunately, the currency that they have preferred to defend themselves against what they see as a very hostile and aggressive and imperialist actions of the West.
Well, that was my next question. China has always been a backer of North Korean ally, but they don't seem to be very happy with these latest threats coming from North Korea. Can North Korea in any way expect support from Beijing?
I think there is a problem of moral hazard in the China-North Korea relationship. The North Koreans know that bad behavior may lead to some reprimands from Beijing, but Beijing has no choice at the end because it would never want Korea to reunify under South Korean and Western aegis. And it would not want to lose this buffer between Western troops that are present in South Korea and the Chinese borders. So North Korea, they will try to preserve it, and I think the North Koreans know that. So in a way, they are also playing on the Chinese patience, knowing fully well that China also has very few options geostrategically. I think they will never abandon North Korea. And in fact, it will remain to be seen because all these sanctions that have been slapped in the last few months since their third nuclear test, it remains to be seen how rigidly and toughly the Chinese enforce these sanctions. So it seems that the North Koreans are calculating that they can get away with all this even threatening war on the United States, knowing fully well that the Chinese have no option. In fact, this is the bigger question. What is the place of the Koreas in the so-called U.S. pivot to Asia? Because the U.S. pivot to Asia was supposed to contain China, as most people believe it. You may want to couch it in more diplomatics, but that is the basic purpose. So if that is the case, these tensions in Korea will, in many ways, play into that larger U.S.-China confrontation in the Asia-Pacific. And I think the Chinese will want to avoid open conflict with the United States at this stage. But then the question is, will North Korea drag them into, unwittingly drag them into a conflict with the United States? And that is where I think China will be hard-pressed to take sides if it ever comes to that kind of situation. But right now, the Chinese want to keep their economic relationship with the United States going, while at the same time preserving what they see as a strategic buffer in the form of North Korea.
Well, that's my next point. Doesn't China have stronger economic ties to the West because of, obviously, their hybrid system of political of communism plus capitalism? Doesn't that, in some way, is that a stronger relationship than the political relationship it has with North Korea?
Yeah, but Rick, there are also geographical compulsions. I mean, China is very keen on dominating Asia and the Asia-Pacific theater and being the sole unquestioned hegemon. China has this, what they call the core interests in reunifying Taiwan and in keeping Tibet and all these sensitive sovereignty issues. And for all these, they don't want open confrontation with the United States in the Asia-Pacific theater. So it's true that they have a booming trade and investment relationship with the United States. And frankly, North Korea probably is not seen as in any way hurting that larger bilateral relationship. In fact, the Chinese are calculating that the U.S. will continue to lean on Beijing to manage the North Korea problem. And and America, at the end of the day, they could bolster Japan, they could bolster South Korea and all their allies in the region. But at the end of the day, if they want a message to get across to the North Koreans, if they want to re-engage with the North Koreans, they will have to go via China. And China knows that it holds the cards in this region. And therefore, it doesn't see it as a trade-off between the larger U.S. relationship and the smaller one with North Korea. And in fact, for all we know, the Chinese would want to, as I said, extract the best for their own national interests from both these pairs of relationships they have.
Overall, if North Korea makes any kind of move toward South Korea, because as you know, they've cut off the hotlines, they no longer adhere to the agreement with the DMZ, to my understanding. If there's any kind of physical incursion into South Korea, will that in some way trigger a response from the U.S.?
Well, the right-wing media in the U.S. is talking about World War III in the Koreas. They want to ratchet up the tension also because it helps them to win more contracts for the Pentagon, which is facing an axe on its budgets. There are people who would want to actually read more than what the North Koreans even want to convey and use this as a pretext. The Republican hawks in the U.S. administration are talking about how we need to build many more missile defense shields against North Korea and Iran and all this. And they will latch on to these chances. And it's important that the Obama administration takes a cool-headed view and try and sort out the issue insofar as not to do this tit-for-tat game where they do a test and then the Americans do a stealth bomber sortie, and then in return the North Koreans threaten war, and then the Americans say that we're going to bolster our offense-defense matrix even more towards Korea. So we need to, there is a need to de-escalate from both sides. And of course, the onus lies on North Korea because the rhetoric has been too shrill. But the point is, if you're carrying a big stick and even if your mouth is shut, it doesn't mean that you are not also spoiling the show. You are also responsible for managing the relationship with North Korea and more importantly with China in a way that does not escalate into open warfare. So World War III, God forbid, but we have spoken about World War III in the past, in the case of Iran a few years ago when the Bush administration was in power. That passed, and I'm hopeful that this will also pass simply because China and the United States cannot afford a conflict at this point in their respective histories.
Well, let me ask you this. You make a good point that both China and the U.S. Certainly don't want any kind of conflict. Is North Korea really worth it in having a conflict between the U.S. and China?
The strategic location of North Korea as a buffer means that China will do everything to save it. So my own feeling is that if the South Koreans cross over first, which is unlikely,
right.
But let's presume that, do a scenario, if they cross over the 38th parallel up north with some Western support in retaliation for some provocation by the North, then, the Chinese will start panicking and will fall in line insofar as protecting and defending their ally goes. If the North Koreans cross over, as you put it, or try to shoot missiles into South Korean territory or Japan, for that matter, I think it will be a more complex approach that the Chinese have to take because there is a danger, as I said before, of massive retaliation from Japan and South Korea backed up by the West. So, and remember, the Chinese have their own problems with Japan over other territorial sovereignty issues. So, East Asia is heavily militarized. Unfortunately, U.S. military bases, the nuclear umbrella there, China's nuclear weapons, and Japan's increasing military muscle in the region. All these mean that, it's a fraught area. And I don't think there's any other region in the world which can be called a tinderbox today with potential nuclear consequences as East Asia is. And therefore, the need for delicate handling, and I hope there is wisdom not only in Pyongyang, but in Seoul and in Washington.
Some very good points, Doctor. We've been talking with Dr. Sreeram Chaulia. He is the Executive Director of the Center for Global Governance and Policy at the Jindal School of International Affairs. We've been talking to him from New Delhi. Sreeram, thanks for joining us again, and we'll talk to you hopefully on another topic.
My pleasure, Rick.
Okay, have a good day.